Hello everyone, my name is Armin Rezai. I am professor at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and today I'll be talking about the EU's journey to net zero. In particular, I will be focusing on the European Green Deal and the challenges and opportunities that come with it. The outline of the talk is such that I would like to begin with a brief motivation for climate policy in the European Union, then talk about the pillars of this climate policy, then talk about the specific goals of EU climate policy until 2030, and close by talking about risks and opportunities in the energy sector. The motivation for climate policy in the European Union is climate change. Here I have two graphs from the IPCC's fifth assessment report. On the first graph on the left-hand side, we see at first the solid black line, which are historical emissions. These have been increasing steadily since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And we see that after 2000, there is several lines in different colors. These correspond to different scenarios that the IPCC has been considering, and the arrow bands, those are the shaded areas around those colored lines, tell us what the likely range of outcomes for each scenario could be. In principle, we see the whole range of outcomes that the scenarios consider. On the one hand, we have the red line, which is steadily increasing further, which corresponds to something like business as usual, with little or no effort to reduce CO2 emissions. And then we have ever increasing in ambition to reduce emissions. And so the most ambitious line is the blue line at the bottom, which is projected to achieve zero emissions by the end of the century, meaning that globally there will be no further emissions until then. Emissions are an important element in climate change, especially of CO2, carbon dioxide. What we're ultimately interested in is depicted on the right-hand side, which is the increase in temperature relative to the pre-industrial era. So how do emissions of greenhouse gases translate into temperature increases? And again, here we see the different scenarios, this times in circles of different colors. And we see the baseline, which is the gray circle, which leads to an increase of about 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. And again, we see that the ambition of climate policy in limiting the emission of CO2 translates into a reduction in temperature, with the most ambitious one being the lowest and smallest circle, where we see that the translation of a net zero achievement by the end of the century is projected to lead to an increase of slightly below 2 degrees Celsius. What needs to be done to achieve such a limitation of the increase in temperature? Done. That can also be rephrased in the form of a net zero narrative, which again means that we need to decarbonize electricity generation, which is currently the biggest contributor, and we would try to achieve a reduction by 2030 of 60% of current emissions and have zero emissions or have some form of negative emissions technology which allows to reduce the ongoing emissions of power plants via carbon capture and storage or other technologies by 2050. So by 2050, we would need to have zero emissions from the electricity generation if we want to be able to stay below 2 degrees and make it to 1.5 degrees, so be in accordance with the Paris Agreement. That's the first point. The second point is the decarbonization of buildings. Again, that we need a 40 to 50% reduction by 2030. So that's on the one hand the increase in the insulation and thereby reducing the energy needed to heat or cool buildings. At the other hand, the installment of new technologies which make it possible to heat and cool without the emission of CO2. Here, heat pumps are a very important element. Thirdly, transportation and industry need to be decarbonized. Here, because of the difficulty of industry, the reduction is only 20% by 2030. And it's important to keep in mind that while 20% doesn't sound much, here we have very long investment horizons, so it's a very slowly rolling stock. Investments made in industry today are on a scale of decades, so that's why the reduction is rather modest by 2030. But it is, of course, the ambition to be near zero by 2050. And we will need negative emission technologies, which are deployed widely by 2050 and onwards to be able to mop up all those places where emissions avoidance is not possible. And of course, all of this is again for the global scale, and advanced economies will have to transition more quickly. That is the outline and the narrative and what would have to be pledged. Unfortunately, the existing pledges of countries are falling behind those plans and the roadmap to 2050. Current stated policies keep emissions constant and lead to an increase of around 2.7 degrees Celsius in temperature. And that's a 50-50 chance. So remember that we had certain confidence interval on the first graph. That is another statement. So we have a 50-50 chance of achieving 2.7 degrees Celsius with the stated policies. The announced pledges, so not the ones that already have been stated, but the aspirational pledges mean that we might be able to stay just above 2 degrees Celsius with a 50-50 chance. Again, this would be inconsistent with the Paris Agreement on the one hand because we're above 2 degrees Celsius, and on the other hand because there is that 50-50 chance that we might actually go further above it. And the key policy domains, as I've said before, are the electrification of all processes emitting CO2, the reduction of electricity used by these processes, so an increase in efficiency, and the complete phasing out of coal in the electricity generation. I want to briefly talk about the financing of these investments and the pledges and the narratives that I mentioned previously. I hinted at it when I talked about the industrial domain and reduction in industry until 2030, that investment cycles have a very long time horizon. So it is not only crucial to keep in mind that we need financing and investments for the transition, but we will also need those investments very early on to set the path for future investments and to lock in the reduction in emissions rather than locking in the emissions themselves if we continue doing business as usual. At the right-hand side here is from the IEA Net Zero by 2050 report, and I want to highlight here that they try to quantify the amount of investments necessary in different sectors. Here, I want to just zoom in onto the electricity generation that's replacing coal and keep up with the increased demand for electricity if we are able to electrify everything. So there is a big growth in demand projected under successful climate policy. And of course, that will require large investments in this sector for electricity generation. And of course, because we would be changing the way that we deliver and use energy and electricity, that there will be changes in energy infrastructure, which have to be financed as well. Now, I want to go on the specific case of the European Green Deal. It has been announced only recently. It's one of the flagship enterprises of the current Commission. And it really has a wide aspiration because it wants to provide not only an environment, an actual natural environment which halts global warming and halts climate change, but it goes beyond that by including air quality, water quality, and soil quality with a more general focus on biodiversity. It talks, of course, about the building renovations that we talked about before when it comes to climate change. The Green Deal also wants to provide and ensure healthy and affordable food for the citizens of the European Union, more and reliable public transport so that the transition away from cars and individual transport becomes more appealing, cleaner energy and cutting-edge clean technological innovation to make sure that we in the European Union are not only avoiding CO2 emissions, but we're also at the forefront of the technological advances necessary to do so, reducing waste and by introducing longer lasting products that can be repaired, recycled, and reused, making sure that nobody's left behind also in terms of jobs and livelihoods, so to provide jobs that are compatible with a changing environment and the energy transition, and to ensure that while doing so, the European economy stays globally competitive and resilient. The European Green Deal builds on an existing, rather successful history of climate policy in the European Union. Here, I'm just plotting the trajectory of CO2 emissions in the EU since 1990. We see a steadily decrease since the late 2000s, leading to the fact that the European Union actually easily achieved its 2020 target. Emissions reduced 31% over 1990 by 2020. Now the new target for 2030 is a 55% reduction. Again, in the terms of the 1990 level, that would translate into a reduction of 40% from today, with the target of net zero by 2050, so zero emissions by 2050. This would be the EU's contribution to staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius with a chance of 66%. However, this is, as I said on the previous slide, an aspiration of the European Commission, and it is very ambitious to put these policies in place. However, the current policies are not yet aligned with this ambition, and the Green Deal is very much work in, as I'm saying on this slide as well. This slide just recaptures what I was saying before. The European Green Deal is the EU's ambition to be carbon neutral by 2050. That means a transformation of European economies and to make them compatible with the Paris Agreement, and is one of the 6 priorities of the current Commission. It is a very overarching policy framework, as we saw with the details before. It not only affects the power sector, it also affects industry, transport, finance, residential buildings, and the construction sector, and how the European Union and its economy engages with other economies. It's the first ever attempt to turn net zero pledges into an actual policy framework with the concrete ambition of reduction of 55% by 2030, which is called the Fit for 55 program. and the development of an institutional framework which will be then built on in the period from 2030 to 2050, where the most difficult and last reductions will have to happen. Just to relate the idea of a price of 100 euros per ton of CO2 to the price of current allowances, I include the development of a price of an allowance in the EU ETS since 2017 on the left-hand side on this slide. There has been a rally over the last year and a half, and in the market for EU carbon permits, and currently prices are above 60 euros per ton of CO2. At the same time, on the left-hand side, on a different time scale, note this one starts at 2012, we see the reduction in the emissions covered by the European emissions trading system, where on the reduction that I mentioned before of 31% for 2020 can be decomposed into the contributions by the power sector and industry. The power sector has undergone the largest revision and is furthest ahead in the transition to a carbon-free economy with a reduction of almost 45% since 2012. Industry has been lagging behind, and there are several reasons for that. At the same time, the Fit for 55 program and the European Green Deal will strengthen its ambition to cover and extend climate policies in this sector. The Social Climate Fund is an additional mechanism to provide support to most vulnerable households and businesses, similar to the Just Transition Fund, but slightly different. Here is a brief timeline to illustrate how much the European Green Deal is work in progress. The Emission only presented the European Green Deal in December 2019 with the commitment to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. In 1 year later, December 2020, it then presented the Fit for 55 program to the European national leaders who endorsed the Fit for 55 target, which has then in June of 2021 been passed as a new climate law. And since then, member states and the European Parliament have been negotiating with the Commission on the exact details of how this climate law and the Green Deal can be implemented. This slide is just a representation of the different aspects that the European Commission, the European Parliament, and national governments are negotiating over. Some of these we already discussed, just like the Just Transition Mechanism or the European Green Deal Investment Plan. Other aspects have not yet been spelled out or are currently being developed, but this graphic shows the far reach of the European Green Deal, not only in the activities it is covering, but also the amount of instruments and policies that will be implemented to achieve those goals. Now, what are the climate policy pillars that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk in the European Union? It is the emission trading scheme that we already talked about. There is the national effort sharing legislation, which covers the emissions that are not covered in the emission trading scheme and are within the national government's legislature and regulation. Here, that's mostly transport, buildings, non-ETS, so industry, so the industry that is not covered by the trading system, agriculture and waste, the reductions have been much more modest, with minus 15% since 2005 as compared to the EU ETS. And the current projection is that this reduction will increase to minus 29% by 2030, aided by some of the European Commission's proposals, such as the second trading system that I mentioned previously. Of course, there's also legislation on land use, which we haven't talked much about. Here, the EU hopes that through the policies of the Green Deal, agriculture, so land use more generally, and forestry will be able to provide a source of negative emissions of about 7% of the emissions, meaning that they will be able to absorb rather than emit emissions. Here I just want to show the air pollution damage in Europe, referring to the negative implications of using coal in the power sector. And if we ignore for now the very large pollution damage in Upper Italy, we see that the most damage is occurring in the countries that I mentioned before, in particular Poland. Seeing the reliance on coal in some of the regions in the European Union, and at the same time the ambition of the European Union in its Green Deal, make some of the listeners wonder whether this is actually feasible. To those listeners, I would like to briefly present the recent developments in the power sector of the United States, in particular the demise of coal use in the power sector of the US over the last couple of years. The left-hand side presents, since the 1950s, composition of the power generation in the United States. And here coal has been the dominant force, with 50% until the end of the 2000s being provided by coal, and only very little of the other renewables, nuclear, petroleum, and natural gas. However, due to developments in fracking and the shale gas boom, natural gas has become a very cheap input, which substituted coal in the generation of power, so that the share of coal dropped from 50% down to 30% within only a decade, or less than a decade. So this is a very significant and rapid shift. In the US, this has been driven by technology, as I said. In the European Union, this is more likely to be driven by policy. As a preview of the financial risks that will be presented in a separate lecture, I also included the stock market valuation of the 4 biggest coal companies of the United States on the right-hand side, where the evolution of the market capitalization from November 2009 until 2016 is plotted, and you see how the value of those 4 coal companies, which covered around a half of the production of coal in 2011 and had a market capitalization of around $33 billion, reduced to virtually nothing only 3 years later, so a reduction of over 99%, to 150 million rather than billion in market cap 5 years later. And this is, of course, because the investors in these companies realize that the market for coal is shrinking and will very likely not come back, and therefore the value of the assets in these companies has been basically written off to zero. Now, for those listeners who are informed about market developments, I just want to point out that there has been a small reversal in this trend over the last 2 or 3 years. This is a brief reprise for coal, mostly due to the cessation of activity in shale gas, and I'm pretty confident that this development of the decline of coal will only continue in the United States and most likely also in Europe. Returning to Europe here, I want to present more of the simulations undertaken by BNEF that I mentioned previously. What are the predictions for coal in the Central, Eastern, and Southeastern European countries? If the European Green Deal is to materialize in the way that it's currently projected, most of the coal mines and power plants will be retired due to climate policy and due to the general cost dynamics, which make renewables also competitive in their own right. Coal will cease as a source of emissions and as a source of air pollution, providing two benefits with one stone. And the least cost projections of that white paper that I mentioned for 2030 for Poland, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and Romania are that they, by 2030, so less than 10 years away, will have a zero carbon share in power generation of 63%, that their power sector emissions will reduce by half as compared to 2018, and coal's share in power generation will reduce by 50%. So this is basically a summary of what you also see in the table presented here, where the reduction in annual emissions as a percentage and absolute between 2018 and 2030 are presented, and also how the share in zero carbon generation and renewable share in generation will evolve over time.